Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Research Community Manager for Sage MethodSpace, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Julianne Cheek and Elise Obi to discuss some aspects of research design featured in their book. And now we're going to talk about Chapter 2 about research ethics. But before we get started, why don't you just introduce yourselves briefly?
Hi, my name is Julianne Cheek. I've taught research methods and design to students for many years, and also answered questions from beginning and experienced researchers about aspects of it along the way. And this is designed to touch on some of the points that they have raised as particular issues for them, common issues that people confront, and also to provide you with an introduction to some of the things you're going to need to think about if you're designing your research.
And I'm Elise Obi, the other author of this book. I first learned to know Julianne as a student, and now we work together.
So this is of course, a large topic, but, as we delve into ethical matters in research design and see all of the different facets, we can see that it's a dynamic process. So, let's begin by just talking about, some of the core important issues. So first, how that you define research ethics?
Well, defining research ethics could take a series of 100 podcasts and we still wouldn't be there. Okay. Some people get very philosophical about ethics, but we try to keep it to the context of research ethics, which some authors have differentiated out. Basically, one of the common definitions of research ethics that you will see is something about a concern with some sort of moral behavior in a research context. So if we go with that one, okay, that research ethics is some sort of moral behavior of research in research context, we have some questions to ask, do we not? And that is, what is moral behavior, and what is the sort of behavior that we need to be concerned about in research context? So what we do in our chapter is we don't get into the chapter on this. We don't get into much of the philosophy of ethics and etc. That's been done to death. We're not looking at the philosophy of ethics. What we're looking at are the philosophical assumptions. Of course, we need to remember that they're there, but what we're interested in is, how do you actually apply this ethical thinking when you are designing research and when you are actually out in the field conducting your research, given that most students and most researchers do not have the time, which would be wonderful if we did, to go and do a full course in ethics and philosophy of ethics. So that is how I would define it, and different people have talked about it in different ways, but that's a common way, and various authors have defined it using those sorts of terms.
So in your book, you draw on Van den Hunard and Van den Hunard to talk about participant confidentiality, anonymity, and consent as keystones to ethical research. And so let's just walk through some of those, first starting with informed consent. What is it, and how do you put that into practice in an ethical way?
Yeah, I mean, I think most people familiar with any sort of research, and any students thinking about research, excuse me, will have been introduced to those three things: consent, and we put informed consent, okay, anonymity, and confidentiality. So when I'm actually going out to do my research for the first one, how do I know that people know what they're participating in? How do I know that they understand any consequences or effects of what they're participating in? How do I make sure that I disclose everything I need to disclose? All right. And how do I make decisions about whether or not they truly understand what I have told them? These are the sorts of issues that we need to look about. We need to think about when we're talking about informed consent, because simply getting someone to sign a form that they have agreed to participate in the study, that's the end point. It's not the whole thing about getting informed consent. Informed consent is about the informed part. And in the book, we go through some of the things that you will need to know if you are going to truly inform someone about your research. Things like, what is the study about? Because often people don't tell people what the real purpose of the study is. There's been some absolute ethical scandals where people have told the study is about one thing, and actually it's quite about another. They deliberately withhold what the study was about in that they, for various reasons. Another thing that people don't think about, and you will need to think about if you are thinking about designing research, is who designed the research. You need to tell people who designed this research and decided the way that it will be done. This is very important, particularly if you're thinking of working with a community that is either underserved or vulnerable in some way, or perhaps culturally different from yourself. How did you make sure that your research was appropriate? How did you make sure that the design of the research was appropriate for the group that you're wanting to research with? And if you're claiming you're researching with them, are you researching with them, or are you researching about them with them? And they're different things. So these sorts of things, like what's the study about, who designed the research? Another thing is, what will the role of the person be that you're getting informed consent from? Have you explained fully what they'll be doing in the project? What will be their role? What will happen with the information they give them? Who benefits from this research? Have you received funding? If you're funded, who's funded you? Who gets to see these results? What will be done with them? What are the costs to me if I want to participate in the research? Like, and I don't mean necessarily dollar or money costs. I mean things like time, things like that. What will the actual costs be? And also, who's going to get this information? Who's got access to my data if I give an interview or I fill in a survey? Who sees this? And also, who am I as the researcher? Who am I affiliated with, and why am I doing this research? Now, that's just a range of things that we talk about in that section, but I think that hopefully listeners are realizing that sometimes we have a very narrow view of what informed consent is, yet again. Okay, informed consent is I fill in a form, I give a little paragraph or summary or abstract of what my research grant proposal was about. I give it to someone, they sign it, and so that I have informed them. Well, what you have done is you have informed them about what part of the study, but informed consent implies that the person has enough information to make an informed decision about whether or not they wish to participate in your research. And they're different things. It's not about informing them about the study. It's about giving them sufficient information that they can make an informed decision about, do I want to participate in this research, given what I have been told about this research?
And it would seem like it also helps the participant or the potential participant think about what it is they want to share. If someone understands that, the value of the potential findings of this study to, make things better, to help with whatever the problem is that's being studied, then, they may feel more motivated to contribute more candidly and more fully. And in the previous episode of this series, you talked a lot about process and the iterative nature of research design. And I think here, that point also applies, to think perhaps of informing that we're going to continue in something that is a multi-stage research process where we have more than one interaction with someone, that we keep checking in with them and, making sure that, they understand what the expectations are and that they're clear about, what's going to happen with this study. And I think that, leads into the next question, to, if you would, to differentiate between confidentiality and anonymity and how you put them into practice. And, especially in our world today where questions about privacy are very complicated.
Yes. Well, I'll start with anonymity. Okay, anonymity basically means that we don't identify people or places or sites, so that we might use what we call pseudonyms, although that's controversial in itself for some people, who gets to choose what pseudonym you give to someone. That is, like, you might call someone a name that isn't their name to keep their real identity anonymous. So what that's designed to do is to protect the identities of the participants, because if we identify the site, it might be possible easily to work back and identify, oh, who's in that site, and yeah, that matches that, etc., and so forth. So anonymity is very important from that point of view. The other thing is that sometimes we will collect demographic data about people, and although we don't state their names, and we might even give them a pseudonym, we can, if we're not careful, identify people from the demographic data. Like if we haven't kept the site anonymous enough, and it's, for example, a certain workplace or a certain factory or a certain school or a certain something, it's possible to work back if our group is a certain group of workers in there. Sure, we might not identify the individual workers, but we put down that participant A was 20 to 25 years old, 2 years experience, working in this department, etc. Very easy to identify, very easy to work backwards. I mean, there is a joke among anthropologists and ethnographers sometimes that people spend more time trying to work out where the study was done, like in Elmtown, classic studies like that, versus what the actual research findings were. So, you know, the thing is, we have to be very careful that we accidentally don't provide information that allows people to be identified and not remain anonymous. Confidentiality, on the other hand, is a bigger term. It's a wider term than anonymity, because what it means is that we are going to, anonymity is part of it, but confidentiality is really about who is going to have access to what I said, who is going to hear what I have said and my views, and how will they be presented, etc., etc. And so confidentiality comes in when we draw up lists of participants, when we collect information sheets and consent forms. It comes in when we have transcripts of interviews, for example. When we have survey questionnaires, we should never have names on those. We should have numbers or identifiers. And confidentiality also comes in when we don't link lists of names and numbers on the same document, like we should be. These are sorts of things for confidentiality. It's a way that we treat the information that we get in such a way that the researchers have access to the information as per the informed consent that the anonymized individuals or sites have given. All right, and no one else has access to that information unless it would be for a very specific purpose. For example, if someone wanted to go back to the data because they were challenging the results or something like that. So confidentiality is much wider, and it is very important that that is explained in the informed consent. You remember that one of the points I mentioned was that you tell the participant who is going to have access to your information. And that's part of the confidentiality, because if you have signed a consent form on the basis you were told that usually if it's a student, it would be the student and their supervisor. Or if it's the research team, it would be the research team or the person collecting the information and the lead researcher. It's important to specify that. And then confidentiality means that they are the people that have access to that information and that specific data. And so anonymity is part of confidentiality, but on its own, it does not ensure confidentiality.
Right. Right. And there's so many tricky situations where, you might have a translator, or you may have some technical assistant if we're doing something online where we've got, there are other people who are assisting us, thinking about not only that the person understands who those individuals are, but that those individuals understand the importance of, they're not discussing, what they've heard and seen. And, so the responsibility, really falls on the researcher to put those things into practice.
I think you're raising hugely important points, Janet. I'd like to go back to something you said a few minutes ago, and that was, you know, that now digital data and internet and whatever else is creating major problems. Yes, and it's not necessarily that you have to be using data off the internet or whatever else, but it's as simple as, where do you store this information? Who has access to it?
Right.
Also, like, are you going to, you know, who actually is going to get into those digital files? When you tell a person that I want you to transcribe this interview for me, if you get a professional transcriber working on your interviews, have you told your participants that a professional transcriber might be working on your interviews? And that's hardly any of us ever do that. All right. And yet, should we be doing that when we are using professional transcribers, et cetera, et cetera? If we use any of our interview material, even if it's de-identified, decontextualized, or whatever, in a classroom when we're teaching, is that acceptable? Is that breaching confidentiality? You know, where is the line in this is very,
Right.
very difficult. And that's why I said that a common one is something about concerned with moral behavior in research contexts. Very difficult. What is moral behavior and what are research contexts? Like, we would not normally think about a transcription of an interview by a professional transcriber as a research context necessarily, but it is. All right. And it should be
Right.
subject to the same sort of decisions about the moral behavior. But more and more, what we find is people are using online services for transcribing. You send your files, you get it transcribed, you get it back digitally. I mean, you know, there are many, many things that we have to be aware of and think about. It's not to make it people, you know, worried that, you know, you can't do these things. You can, but they raise a lot of questions that need to be thought through and clearly answered. And this is where it impacts back on the design of the research, because sometimes the way that you thought that you could do your research in the most effective and efficient way may not be possible, because it's not possibly the best way of ensuring moral behavior in research context. So here we have, you know, for fast research or for whatever else, we have to be careful that what compromises are we making, and are we sure, okay, of the consequences of them, and are we sure that our participants know what choices we have made for them effectively if we do not tell them.
So at the design stage, we really need to be evaluating if we're using online or digital tools, you know, especially AI kinds of tools where you put the information in, but you can't take the information back and you can't protect it. You know, so evaluating the tools to make sure that they will allow you to protect the data, and that then you can communicate to your participants the, you know, responsible behaviors that you have used to protect that data. And, you know, so it's kind of at the design process, evaluating, making sure you've chosen, you know, the best tools and the best partners and assistants that you can, who will understand the responsibility you have to protect the data, particularly when we're talking about sensitive issues where, you know, the revelation of the person's identity could really subject them to some kind of harm. So
I think that AI comment of yours is a really interesting one, because we didn't explore that in the book so much, because I mean, this is, you know, an emerging issue, but it's one that I think about a lot, because there's been a lot written about data storage and repurposed data and reusing data and digital archives, etc. But we haven't even begun to think about what does AI access to those things mean, and what should it have access to, and what should it not have access to, etc., etc. These are the issues of the future that we are going to have to, we're really going to have to struggle with. And there are no easy answers to this.
Right. There are not easy answers, partly because, you know, for those who are watching this, you certainly understand that many of the tools that we might use as researchers were not designed with research in mind. So, you know, they don't have the kind of stringent protection of data as a part of their design. In fact, it's the opposite. Their tool may be completely designed to benefit from the data that's entered into it. So, being able to evaluate those tools is really going to be, I think, an essential part of the design process. And, really goes back to, as you've mentioned before, the ethical thinking. This is not just about completing a form and signing off on it. It really requires, some soul searching on your own part to decide, what you believe is right, and to make, the best kinds of decisions that you can. And, the answers are not always easily available. So it will take some digging in most cases. And so that kind of ties into, the next question about reusing, repurposing, and sharing data. So, what guidance do you offer about that?
Well, I think that resharing and reusing and repurposing data raises that whole issue of informed consent. I'd like to land on that one for a while, because we talked about the fact that it's really important that people know what their information is going to be used for, what their data is going to be used for, etc., etc. I don't know about both of you, but if someone asks me to participate in a study, I make a decision based on, do I think that this study is significant? Do I think it's going to be worthwhile? Do I think it's going to say something that is not overloading participants with time wasted because in the end the design is so poor or the methods are inappropriate, etc., that we can't achieve a good result? Because that is unethical practice as well, of course. So what I'm concerned about is if I give a series of interviews for a study and then someone else comes along to that data and reanalyzes it, repurposes it, or takes parts of it, have I really given informed consent for that second person to do so? And this is an issue, like how far does informed consent go when you have signed it off? People have come up with various solutions for this. Like some of them are saying that we could have different types of consent, where I say I consent to the researchers using this information for this study only, or I consent to this group of researchers being able to use my information. They can repurpose it, they can share it or whatever, but it's these researchers. Or I simply consent to allowing my data to be used for other studies, etc., etc. And I will never know what studies they might be. For me personally, I shouldn't say this, I suppose, but I will not give that consent. The last one, I like to know what studies the information is being used for. I think these raise lots of ethical questions. And once again, we said at the start that informed consent is much more than just a consent form. And yet we often have people, they think that getting the consent form signed, I've got informed consent. My students will say that to me. I got informed consent. I got the consent form signed.
Right.
I say, well, how did you know when you got the consent form signed, you had informed consent? Oh, what do you mean? So we're in a little circular thing until I start trying to unpack the fact that the signing of the form is not the equivalent of getting informed consent. So I think I've just given 3 examples of some of the ways that some of researchers and scholars have suggested that we might go about this. In the book, we actually go into this in a bit of detail about sharing, etc., what people have said, etc., etc., controversies, etc. There are some people who say that if your research is funded, then you have a responsibility to share your data with the public because it's the public that's funding it. Other people say no, the rights of the participants override that, etc., etc. And we actually show that. And we also talk about in the book about Beck, who suggests multiple layers of consent, which is a bit like what I was talking about, and etc., etc. But nevertheless, the point is that there are no absolute rights or absolute wrongs in this. What there is the need for, once again, responsible, reflexive, ethical thinking. What we were talking about in the first episode that we talked about if we keep those things in mind, reflexive, keep thinking about what might this mean for my, if I design it in this way, etc., etc. If I go to repurpose or reuse, what might I need to think about in terms of the ethics? Do I feel comfortable with that? And I think if we keep those things in mind, we'll be able to navigate these challenges. We're not trying to say that the challenges are insurmountable or anything. We're simply saying that to design good research means we have to be aware of the challenges. We have to make some informed decisions about how we're going to navigate them. And then we need to inform people about what we've decided so that they can make an informed decision about whether or not they wish to participate in this research. Then we are getting much closer to informed consent, which is one of the three pillars, and I agree with Van Huynard, right? One of the three pillars of ethical research.
So, in your chapter, you emphasize focusing on the principles, not the requirements, is important when working with the ethics committee or a institutional review board. And I think, we've kind of already discussed this, that it's, it's not simply, working through a checklist. There's, we need to consider all of the different factors, the nature of the study, the level of sensitivity, the potential risk to the participants, the population we're studying, and how much they might understand about, what does research even mean, what their, what their assumptions might be about participating in a study, what are, other kinds of principles that we've missed so far.
Well, I think where we're talking about the ethics is, about doing ethics rather than, conforming to certain requirements. Okay, we talk about that in the context of working with ethics committees and institutional review boards. And the reason why we did that was that it was interesting to me that students would talk to me about, I just got ethics. I'd come back and say, Julianne, I'm really happy I've got my ethics. I've got ethics. And I'm thinking, that's interesting. So what does that really tell us? That ethics is becoming equated with getting the formal sign-off by the IRB or by the ethics committee. But that undersells the purpose of IRBs and ethics committees, and it also undersells the importance of the moral behaviour in research contexts. And so what we're highlighting is that ethics committees and IRBs are extremely important. They are extremely important in the process, but they are not just regulatory bodies. They cannot be just reduced to bodies that tick off lists. They're actually educative bodies that work with people to ensure that they are navigating these sorts of things and ask the sorts of questions that need to be asked. So what we're saying is that, ethics committees have sometimes been criticized for being very deterministic in what constitutes research, what constitutes this, that, and the other. And that is deserved in some cases. But ethics committees actually play an important role. Not only are they gatekeepers for who can or can't do the research, but they're actually important in raising people's understandings about what research is, etc., etc. And I think that's an example of what we mean by focusing on what matters and the processes rather than just the requirements. Just checking off the requirements of an ethics committee, coming back and saying, I've got ethics, right, indicates to me a requirement checklist type thinking, because then I would ask, what do you mean you've got ethics? Do you mean you've met the requirements of the ethics committee? That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to do ethical research. So there's a bit of that slurring, a bit of that checklist type thinking coming in.
Right. I think it's important for new researchers and student researchers who are, dealing with that, to realize these committees serve as an oversight for the institution, for the government of whatever country you're in that has, kind of baseline requirements that need to be met. So they provide a certain kind of oversight. Your supervisor provides another kind of oversight. But there are a lot of times in the research process where it's just you and your computer, or it's just you and your participant, and you have to provide your own oversight to make sure that, you know, you're doing what you have said you were going to do, and that you are keeping these kinds of principles in mind. So I think that your point about the reflexivity and the moral and ethical thinking are really important ones for new researchers to really grasp. Is there anything else that you want to add about chapter 2?
Just that, look where we put the discussion of ethics. It was in chapter 2. It's in the first substantive focused chapter of the whole of the book about research design, and there's a reason for that, because ethical thinking has to permeate the whole of the process of designing research, right through from, should I study this topic? Is this a topic that should be studied? And if it is, should it be studied in this way? And then how am I actually going to do it in terms of the informed consent, anonymity, confidentiality, etc. So I take it back even one step back in research design. Should I be doing this research at all? Do the costs of this research outweigh the benefits, or do the benefits outweigh the costs? To whom bears the load of this research, and who decides whether it's acceptable that some bear the load and some don't? So these are big questions all the way in which we design our research. And just to toss another left field in, okay, is students probably don't think about this much, but my question is, have you thought about the feasibility of you being able to complete your research in the way that you say? Have you got the resources to complete the research in the way that you have designed it? Do you have access to what you need to be able to complete the research? Are you confident that you can gain the participants you need for this research? Because feasibility is an important part of ethical practice, in my view. If you are not able to conduct the research, if you don't have the resources, if you don't have the time, then you are effectively wasting people's time that you do interview, etc., etc. And to me, that's also an ethical issue. You are also by default promising them that you are going to do a certain piece of research and you don't. And the other thing I say to people is, don't promise things that you don't follow through on. For example, don't promise that you will send people back their interviews to look at if you have no intention of doing so. Don't promise that you will send people back the results of the research if you have no intention of doing so, because what that is, in my view, is a breach of ethical behavior. People are promised that if you participate, I will give you a summary of the results, or I will let you know how the research goes, and then they're forgotten in the euphoria of finishing the research or whatever else. These things are very important. How you end your research and how you begin your research is just as important as how you conduct your research on the way through. And I think personally that too much emphasis has gone on the middle. It has to be emphasized, of course, but to the detriment of the other ends. This is a whole of research design process, and that's why this chapter came at chapter 2. Ethics is the whole of the design process. You cannot design research without thinking about ethics at every single point.
Okay, well, thank you. And for those who are watching, hope that you'll take a look at the other episodes so you can see how the ideas we've suggested here about reflexivity and ethical thinking tie into other areas of the research process.